Hello everyone! While the foundation of my future house is gaining strength so that I can start building the walls, I'll tell you how I made the reinforcement frame for my future insulated Swedish slab. The ribs of the foundation were 30 by 30 centimeters in size. For their reinforcement, 6 rods with a diameter of 12 millimeters were used, 3 rods on top and 3 rods on the bottom. For the stirrups, I used 8 millimeter rebar ordered from the nearest metal base. The rods were 6 meters long, since delivering 11 meter 700 millimeter rods here is nearly impossible. It's better not to order rebar too far in advance or leave it outside for a long time, otherwise it will rust badly and the connection with the concrete will be poor. I cut the rebar for the stirrups in batches of several pieces at a time. The first thing I needed to do was bend the stirrups. For this I made a simple experimental device out of 2 pieces of wood and a pallet just to try out how it would bend. So here we just have a piece of wood with a hole drilled in it. The wood won't last long, it's already started to crack. Here mine are square, so each side is 22 centimeters. That's why I've measured 22 centimeters from this edge to that edge, and then I just move it along. If it were a rectangle, you would just need to add another piece of wood that would be a bit shorter in height. This lets you slide the long side to the far piece of wood and rest the short side against the closer piece. The construction is like this, but this part needs to be made of metal because a wooden one won't last long, but I put it together in just 2 minutes from what I had on hand. But it turned out by accident that I bent all the rebar I needed for the foundation using this thing. Then I made a tying table out of a chair, a bucket, and scraps of foam board, just to try and see how it would work. I had never tied rebar before, this was my first time. It's very convenient to tie the frame when the rebar is, roughly speaking, at the height of a kitchen table, so you don't have to bend over because your back definitely won't thank you for that. Tying the frames and foundation inside is uncomfortable and impractical. Never, so it's better to tie it somewhere separately and then bring it in. As binding wire, they use wire with a thickness of 0.81 millimeters. I didn't know how much was needed, so I just took what was sold in the store, tried it, and it turned out I needed 2 ready-made coils like this. 1 coil of binding wire was just enough for a foundation of 50 square meters. I bought more because I still need to tie the reinforcement belt and lintels anyway. This is all that's left from that coil. It still won't be enough, so I bought another. I just tie it with a regular hook myself. Some people invent hooks, try to make them out of nails or rebar, some even try to twist it with a screwdriver. I don't see any point in that. A regular hook costs 300 rubles in the store. There are some semi-automatic ones, but it seemed to me that the regular one is more practical. At first I thought that bending the clamps would take the most time because you need a lot of them. The clamps were placed every half meter, but it turned out that I bent them very quickly using this device and a pallet of wood. I thought cutting the rebar would take a long time, but it's actually quick if you do it in batches. In the end, it turned out that the longest part was actually tying the frame. I would lay 6-meter rods on this table, put clamps on them and tie them. It's not complicated, just very labor intensive due to the amount of work. Here's how I tie rebar. I take a wire, bend it in half, then bend it again so the ends are just a bit higher, thread it through the rebar frame, use a hook, pull it through the loop, and bend the ends down. Squeeze it tight and twist it. Tighten it properly, take out the hook, done. When you've tied one row, it's best to do the second row so that you can tie it from underneath. This lets you insert the rods from below, so they're not just lying there, since lifting and tying the second row is less convenient. I carried the finished frames to their places and it was quite difficult. 6 6-meter rods, 12 rebar with clamps every half meter weigh a lot, and carrying them alone was very hard. I threw out my back doing this, so it's better to carry it together. It's very heavy, but you can lift it. The problem is that it bends like this, so when one person carries it, it catches on everything possible. Since my foundation is 7.5 by 8 meters, I needed some shorter frames as well. I cut them from the long frame right on site, that is, I assembled the 6-meter rods with the required number of stirrups, set them in place, then cut off the finished frame and took that small piece to where it was needed. These two frames needed to be overlapped. The minimum overlap is 40 times the diameter of the rebar. So if we're using 12mm rebar, the minimum overlap should be 48 centimeters in the foundation frame. I used special rebar spacers that create a protective layer of concrete. I bought a few spacers, barely found them, 40mm for the protective layer. Usually for some reason they only sell 25, 30 or 40mm. It was hard to find. The next step was to reinforce the corners. According to the drawing, the corners are reinforced like this. In reality, I ended up with something similar. When building a reinforcement frame, tying the corners properly is crucial. For this, I bent the 12th rebar so that there was an overlap of half a meter with the 12th rebar and the 8th. It's much harder to bend it. But in principle it's possible, even with a wooden stick. To be continued, it's going well. And so that I don't have to worry about it not fitting later, I checked the angle with the table, almost perfect, so I won't have to stress on site or bend anything. You need to bend and tie it in such a way that the rebar comes together so it works properly. You need to tie it like this, and you should put these things on every working rebar, on every row. For me, that's 3 on top and 3 on bottom. Here is a decently tied corner, everything is securely fastened, and everything fits tightly everywhere. The reinforcement should work well and shouldn't move anywhere during pouring. It took me about 2 days to reinforce the foundation ribs. I took my time. Next, it was necessary to tie the mesh under the floor of the future house. For this, I used rebar with a diameter of 10mm and a grid size of 20 by 20 centimeters. At first, I laid out the rods one by one over the surface of the future foundation. It took a very long time. Later, I started laying them out in bundles. Most of the time is spent laying out the rebar on the foundation since it needs to be placed in 2 layers and checked. I checked the size everywhere with a square to make sure the grid was exactly 20 by 20, since my foundation is again 1.5 by 8 and 2 meters. Sometimes there weren't enough rods, and I also made an overlap of 40 diameters. For 10mm rods, that's 40 centimeters, but I made it a little bit more. I tied the mesh through every other rod, meaning it's not necessary to tie every intersection. I tied it through every other rod. I also put the mesh on rebar spacers, but they're pretty expensive. I didn't know how many I would need, so I bought 100 pieces to start with at 7 rubles each, and that wasn't enough for the whole foundation. So the ribs, the reinforcement frame for the ribs, were completely set on spacers. I walked along the ribs, but there weren't enough spacers under the mesh, so I cut small cubes out of foam board to put under the mesh. And it turns out that when the mesh presses them down under load, we end up with a protective layer of about 4 centimeters. I sat on a box to make it more comfortable because you can't even tie 50 square meters while squatting. So I was tying for 2 whole working days, so you need to take care of your back. I tied rebar while sitting and moving the box, which was convenient. I had some extra rebar and calculated what I still needed. And I used a few rods to reinforce the mesh under the future partitions. Since my load-bearing walls are only the exterior ones and the partitions are just enclosing structures, there are no ribs under the partitions. And basically the project doesn't provide for any reinforcements, but if you can play it safe, it's better to play it safe. That's why I added a few rods under the future partitions. After tying the reinforcement frame in the traditional insulated Swedish plate, the next step is laying the water underfloor heating pipes. I'm going to have underfloor heating, but it will be electric. I'll explain why I made this choice in one of the next videos. From leftover geotextile, leftover sand, leftover gravel, leftover rebar. I did a little preparation for the driveway since we always have to order extra concrete, so it was assumed that I would use the leftover concrete from the foundation to pour the driveway. That's why I prepared a rebar mesh for the driveway in exactly the same way, and everything was ready for the concrete pour. I'll talk about that next time. Subscribe so you don't miss the next video and leave any questions in the comments. I read it all and will reply to everyone. Thanks for watching. Bye.